Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's episode starts with doggies and eventually gets us to the risks of consuming mouse meat.
Get a baby mouse and put it in a bottle.
But as always, we have to get there, so let's get started. As you may have noticed, we have with us a very special guest, my very sweet little doggie Lizzie. And Lizzie is here because dogs are actually mentioned in this week's Torah portion. In this week's Torah portion, Parshah's Boy, we hear about the last three plagues, locusts, darkness, and death of the firstborn, and then the Jews finally begin to leave Egypt. It's during Makas Becheres, the plague of the death of the firstborn, that the Torah mentions dogs. Here's what it says in the Parsha. L'chol b'nei Yisrael le'yechratz kelov l'shonei l'me'ish v'ad behema l'man tedun asher yifla Hashem be'Mitzrayim uvein Yisrael. But for all B'nai Yisrael, a dog will not sharpen its tongue at man or animal. You will then know that Hashem distinguishes between Egypt and Yisrael. So during the plague of the death of the firstborn, it says that no dog would sharpen its tongue. It's kind of a strange wording, and different commentaries explain it in different ways, but it either means barking or biting. Either the dogs didn't bark or the dogs didn't bite.
At bark.
Another kind of ambiguous thing about this verse is the way that I've always heard it referenced is that the dogs didn't bark at the Israelites while they were escaping from Egypt. And while that escape does happen in this Parsha, the actual placement of the verse is during the plague of the death of the firstborn. I did find some commentaries that placed this idea of the dogs not barking in that moment of the Jews escaping, but it seems like most commentaries left it in its place during the plague of the death of the firstborn. And in that context, it seems to me like it means that even though there was so much chaos going on,
This is complete chaos!
the dogs weren't making it even worse by barking or biting. Either way, it's considered a very good thing, and the dogs end up actually getting rewarded for this later on. It says that when you encounter a mortally injured animal in the field, don't eat its meat, instead give it to the dogs. Many commentaries wonder why the Torah tells us to specifically give this meat to dogs. Seemingly it would be enough just to tell us that we can't eat it. What are we supposed to learn from the fact that we're supposed to give it to dogs? According to Rashi, and he's quoting from Mechilta, he says that this is a reward. A reward for what? For what happened in our Parsha when the dogs didn't bark at us or bite us. And this is supposed to show us that Hashem gives everything the reward that it's due. And therefore, because the dogs didn't bark or bite way back in Egypt, now forever and ever to this day, if Lizzie and I are ever going on a walk and we find a mortally wounded sheep, that's for her. You happy with that, Lizzie? You like that? It's a good deal. But, according to the Balei Tosfos, the dogs are being rewarded here, but for something else. They say that the reason why the dog gets this mortally wounded animal is because they're being rewarded for guarding our animals. The dogs are the ones that have been guarding our sheep from wolves.
Morning, Ralph. Morning, Sam.
So as a reward for doing such a good job guarding our sheep, when one slips through the cracks, they get the meat. Which is an interesting alternate explanation because instead of linking it to something that happened thousands of years ago, it's more about rewarding our little doggies for the things that they continue to do for us on a daily basis. Okay, we still have a lot of cool stuff to discover, but I'm going to let Lizzie go because it's late and she is a sleepy doggie. Alright, thank you very much, Lizzie. Okay, so far we've got two different possible reasons for why dogs are rewarded with being given treif meat. One is from our Parsha when the dogs didn't bark or bite, and the other is because they have loyally guarded our animals to protect them from becoming treif. But in Tractate Kala Rabasi, it gives us another way that dogs are rewarded for not barking or biting back in Egypt. It says there that their reward is that their excrement is used for making Torah scrolls and mezuzahs.
What you talking about, Rabbi?
Yes, you heard that right. Dog poop used to be used in the process of tanning leather. It was used as a cicative, a drying agent to dry out the oils in the animal hide. And parchment is made from animal hide. So historically, all of the Jewish ritual objects that used leather or parchment, such as Torah scrolls and mezuzahs and tefillin, all of those very holy things needed dog poop. Today, there are other chemicals that can serve that purpose, and so as far as I know, in most places, dog excrement is no longer used in the tanning process. But for a very long time, this was an integral part of the tanning process. And in the Victorian era, dog poop used for this purpose was called pure. And there was a job that people had called a pure finder. where they collected dog poop and sold it to leather makers. But this job of the poop collector actually comes up in Gemara and in Halacha.
Here we have a well glimpse of the poopsmith in his natural habitat.
In Halacha, the dog poop collector has a name, mekamitz. It shows up in a few different areas of Halacha, but usually grouped together with other professions that are particularly smelly. There's an idea that starts in Gemara in the Talmud and then makes its way into Halacha, and the source that I'm going to quote here is the way Rambam brings it as a Halacha in Mishnah Torah. Halacha is about the Sholish Regalim, the 3 festivals. Every year, every single Jew is supposed to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem 3 times, for Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuos. And there's a possibility mentioned in Gemara that perhaps people who have particularly smelly jobs that make them very smelly should be excluded from this so that they don't ruin it for everybody else. And the halacha is, no, everybody's included. Even the copper miner, the leather worker, and the dog poop collector. They clean themselves up and they join everybody else. But, as I said, this isn't the only place where the dog poop collector gets mentioned in halacha. It's all over the place. Another place that it gets talked about is in the laws of marriage and divorce. There's a concept in Jewish law called a kesubah. It's not just a pretty thing to hang on your wall, but it's actually a legal document. And it entitles the wife to a certain amount of money if they get divorced or if her husband dies. But if they get divorced, the wife doesn't always get the kesubah money. Only if they get divorced for certain reasons. So in Mishnah Torah, Rambam is going through all of those conditions when a wife would be entitled to the kesubah money, and this is what it says. It says that if after a couple gets married, the husband becomes afflicted with some sort of physical disability or ailment. For example, if he loses a hand or a foot or an eye, in cases like that, if the wife wants to divorce the husband because of that physical disability, she doesn't get the kesubah money. Of course, they can get divorced, but she doesn't get the money. But if after they get married, he suddenly develops chronic bad breath or chronic bad nose smell, which, by the way, I don't know what that is, a foul odor emitting from one's nose. I've never encountered that personally. If anybody does knows what that is, please let me know in the comments. Anyways, if the husband develops chronic bad breath or chronic bad nose breath or becomes a copper miner or a dog poop collector, then if she says, I don't want to remain married to this guy, she does get all of the money. Of course, she could also say, no, I love my dog poop collector, I want to stay married to him. So this halacha is delightful to me for multiple reasons. First of all, it gives us more details into the role of the dog poop collector in society and attitudes towards them. And also, in some cases, it can be a beautiful little love story. But that love story actually comes up again in a later halacha. What if the dog poop collector dies and the couple hadn't had children yet? In that case, there's a mitzvah of yibum. We spoke about this a little bit in an earlier episode, and you can check that out there. But the basic idea is that if a man dies without having any children, then there is now an obligation on the widow and the man's brother to be married, and the first child that they have together continues the lineage of the deceased husband. Of course, if they don't want to get married, they don't have to. There is a ritual called chalitza, and they can perform that ritual, and then they are relieved of that obligation. But the same conditions still apply for whether or not the wife gets the kesubah money. So the situation is this. A man and a woman get married. The man becomes a dog poop collector after they get married. She has the right to leave him and get her full kesubah money, but she says, no, I love him, I want to stay married. But then he passes away, and his brother is also a dog poop collector. Apparently it's a family business. In that case, you might think that since she already illustrated that she's okay with dog poop collectors, then she's given up her right to demand the kesubah money on those grounds. She stayed with the first guy even though he was a dog poop collector. How could she turn down this guy just because he's a dog poop collector? But the halacha is that she can. She can say that for my original husband, it didn't bother me, but for this guy it does. Which is kind of a bummer for the dog poop collector's dog poop collecting brother. Because not only is he a dog poop collector, he's also been told that apparently his brother pulled it off, but he doesn't.
Yeah, where is your brother anyway? He looks like a sensitive and sober fellow.
Okay, so at this point in the rabbit hole, I was ready to go all in on the dog poop collector and see where it took me. But in order for that to happen, I had to see it show up in different types of places. And I did my digging. I searched for mekamitz, the word for the dog poop collector. And I didn't really find a lot that took me off in enough of a direction to completely dedicate the rest of the rabbit hole to the dog poop collector. But the mekamitz did show up in one more interesting place that I didn't expect it to, and that's Jewish philosophy. In the introduction to Choves HaLevavis, translated as Duties of the Heart, which is a theological text which outlines the duties of the heart, the things that Jews are required to believe. In the introduction, the author is explaining why he needed to write this book. It was written right after the era of the Gaonim, and he goes through and defines the different types of Jewish literature that exist at that point. He says that there are halacha svarim, books that tell us how to perform mitzvahs, and then he describes a category of Jewish literature which appears to be philosophy. He says that this category of books aims to provide logical proofs to refute the claims of heretics and people who don't believe in Torah. And he lists 3 examples of this category. One of them is Amunis V'Deis from Sajagain. Another one is called Sharei Hadas, which I didn't recognize. And the third is Sefer HaMakamitz, which I also didn't recognize. But what is that? That's a strange title for a philosophy book. If you remember, Makamitz means a dog poop collector. So is this book called the Book of the Dog Poop Collector? So I searched for Sefer HaMakamitz. The only place that exact phrase, Sefer HaMakamitz, comes up is in Choves HaLevavis and commentaries on it. There doesn't appear to be a Sefer HaMakamitz in existence. But there are some who suggest that it's referring to a person, Dawood ibn Mirwan al-Mukammatz al-Raqi, who lived in Syria in the 900s at the end of the period of the Gaonim, but he wasn't part of the Gaonim. He's barely mentioned anywhere in Jewish literature. And the Wikipedia article on him suggests some weird possibilities about his life. So I'm not going to get into him too much, but if that is him, then the word Makamitz here isn't referring to the dog poop collector, it's just referring to his name, Mukammatz, which seems like it's not related to that word at all. But there's a commentary on Choves HaLevavis called Pas Lechem, which explains why this book is called Sefer HaMakamitz in an interesting way. It says it's called Sefer HaMakamitz, the book of the dog poop collector, because it collected all of the dog poop ideas and showed them for what they were and refuted them, which is an interesting way to describe a philosophy book. And it seems like this commentary is using that as a way of describing that entire genre of Jewish philosophy at that time, to collect the dog poop ideas and refute them, which in the context of the introduction to Choves HaLevavis makes sense, because he's trying to illustrate that there's a gap that still needed to be filled, which is not just refuting bad ideas, but mapping out exactly what are the ideas that Jews are supposed to believe and think. Okay, so now we're going to leave the subject of the dog poop collector and go back to the topic of the dogs who didn't bark at us or bite us back in Egypt. But we're going to continue a little bit on the theme of philosophy. Malbim raises an interesting philosophical question about this reward. If you remember, we said earlier that as a reward for not barking at us or biting us back in Egypt, dogs are given the meat of an animal that turns out to be treif. Malbim raises an interesting philosophical question about this reward. He asks, why would dogs be rewarded at all? All of their behavior is instinct. They don't have free will the way a human being has free will.
I still have to maintain that it comes down to whether or not this will guy is being held captive for good reason.
Of course, that's a topic that could be a rabbit hole all in itself, but we're just going to take it for what it is right now and accept that according to Malbim, dogs don't have free will, and therefore, why should they be rewarded? And his answer is that even though the dogs may not technically deserve the reward, they're given a reward anyways, so that we can say, if dogs are rewarded, and they didn't even make a free choice, they just acted on instinct, how much more so are we rewarded and punished for our actions, which we freely choose? Okay, so at this point in my research, I decided to expand my search radius beyond just the dogs not barking or biting in Egypt. So I searched for dogs just to see where they would show up in various Torah texts, and there's an interesting section in Gemara where the students of Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok are asking him a series of animal-related questions. It seems like they got him in a certain mood, and they felt like they were able to ask him a bunch of different questions about animals, and they asked him about dogs and cats and mice. We're going to start with the question about mice because it actually ties in nicely with what we were talking about before, about whether animals are rewarded and punished. So here's what it says in Gemara. The students of Rabbi Elazar asked him, why are mice preyed upon by so many different animals? Basically, why are they the bottom of the food chain? And Rabbi Elazar answered them, Mipnei shesuran ra, because their inclination is evil. Then the Gemara gives an example of what that means, that their inclination is evil, which is that they even gnaw on clothes, which is something that has no nutritional value for them. They're just gnawing on it anyways. So, according to Rabbi Elazar, why do mice deserve to be preyed upon by everybody else? Because they're jerks. Because because they chew on everything, not just for survival, for no reason, just because they're jerks. When we bought our house about 12 years ago, one of the selling points was that it had a brand new dishwasher. Very shortly after we moved in, mice gnawed the wires and hoses on the dishwasher, rendering it completely useless. We had people come in to try to repair it, and they said it was hopeless, and therefore for years we just had a broken dishwasher that we couldn't use. Eventually we had to replace it, which cost hundreds of dollars. The mice also gnawed through the hoses of our underfloor heating, which caused thousands of dollars worth of damage just in like flooding and water damage, even without replacing the heating, which we eventually had to do, which also cost us money. The point being, mice are jerks. And apparently their jerkiness can cause even bigger problems. Thank God we never had to deal with this, but apparently mice gnawing on wires can actually cause electrical fires. So, very clearly, mice are jerks. But what's interesting to me about this is the philosophical question. Going back to Malbim asking why dogs get a reward if they don't have free choice, in that case, it's interesting that here we say that mice are punished for being jerks. Especially because it's even more clear here that this is something that's in their nature. It's built into how they are. As opposed to the dogs not barking and biting in Egypt, that was something that went against their nature. So I didn't see anybody discuss this question, and I think it's an interesting one. If any of you have some thoughts on it, or if you've seen any sources that discuss why mice deserve to be punished for something that is seemingly just built-in part of their nature, please let me know in the comments. But the animal questions don't stop there. Rabbi Elazar's students ask him more questions. They actually asked this question earlier, but I started with the mouse one because it fit with the philosophical stuff. But here's a question they ask about dogs and cats. They say, why does a dog recognize its owner, but a cat doesn't recognize its owner? Now, before we get to the answer, I should tell you that there's a halacha that you shouldn't eat food that's been nibbled on by mice. And the reason that's given is because it's kasha l'shichicha. It's bad for your memory. It can make you forgetful. So going back to the Gemara, why don't cats recognize their owners? Because if eating something that a mouse ate from is bad for your memory, then how much more so eating an actual mouse?
What is inordinately short attention span, Alex?
So according to this, the reason why cats don't recognize their owners is because they forget them. They eat mouse meat, it makes them forgetful, and they just keep on forgetting who that person is. And I actually discussed this with a lovely group of people in Chicago. Thank you very much for having me. And as soon as I read this piece from Gemara, they were all nodding, yeah, that makes sense. Dogs recognize their owners, cats don't. But I bet there are some cat people out there who would say, no way, there are a lot of cats who recognize their owners and who are very loyal. And you're not alone. The Ben Ish Chai actually asked that question as well. This is what he says. He says there are many, many stories in various nature books that illustrate how loyal cats can be. And then he gives one example of a specific story, which I didn't put in the source sheet, and I'm not going to put it up on the screen because it's way too long, but I'll tell it to you now. This is the story as told by the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad. He says there was once a boy who had a cat, and the cat loved him very much. And even when the boy wasn't so nice to the cat still loved him and was very attached to him, and eventually they became inseparable, and they loved each other very much. One day the boy fell ill with smallpox, and when he was sick in bed, the cat would come and sit by his bed constantly. Eventually the boy got very, very sick, and he was dying, and they locked the cat up in a different room. And after the boy passed away, they let the cat out, and it ran out of the room that he was locked in and back into the room that the boy was in before he had passed away, and the cat was looking around, and he couldn't find the boy. And he ran all around the house looking, and he was very sad and became inconsolable and was crying and howling. Eventually the cat ran away, and sometimes it would show up at a different house. It would keep on coming back to this other house, but then it would disappear for long stretches of time, and it would just come back to this house just to get fed, and then it would run away again, and no one knew where. Until eventually one time somebody was walking in the cemetery, and they saw that this cat had dug out a little hole near the grave of the boy. The cat had found the grave of this boy and had created a little hole for itself, and it just sat there all day, every day, and it only left to go get food, and then it came back. And so, the question the Ben Ish Chai asks is, we see from this story and many others like it, that cats can recognize their owners. So what's this whole conversation in the Gemara about? The entire premise of the question that Rabbi Elazar's students asked, that why do cats not recognize their owners, is a false premise. And so he says that you can answer this based on Rabbi Elazar's answer, that we must only be talking about cats who eat mouse meat. But a cat who lives in the house and is fed from the owner's table and doesn't eat mouse meat, then that cat wouldn't be forgetful and they would remember their owner. So that's interesting to me because one way to look at it is if you feed a cat, it will like you and recognize you and come back to you. So it's interesting to think of it from kind of a different perspective, to say that it's actually the specific type of food that you'd be feeding it would be better for its memory so that it could remember you.
You see, our balanced meal always wins with our vitamins.
I just think that's an interesting way to look at it. Alright, one more thing about dogs from a different Gemara, that Reish Lakish says that there are 3 groups that are impudent or disrespectful. Among nations, it's Jews, among animals, it's dogs, and among birds, it's chickens. So Jews, dogs, and chickens are all the impudent or disrespectful groups among their larger category. I'll tell you why this was interesting to me, because I've only heard Jews and dogs grouped together in one other context, and that's anti-Semites. No Jews or dogs allowed. That's where I've heard that. So it's kind of interesting to see Jews and dogs grouped together, especially in a negative context, in our own book. But what's really interesting to me is that some anti-Semites really love to quote the Talmud, but they never quote this. They always quote the parts that say stuff that they don't like, that makes them mad. But here's something that they would probably really like, and they never quote that. So I feel kind of bad for the anti-Semites. They're stuck in all the parts that make them angry, but here's something that they might really like. Alright, so we're almost to the end of the rabbit hole, but I've got one more thing I want to share with you. It's a piece from a Reshima of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which are the Rebbe's personal notes that were discovered and printed after the Rebbe passed away. So they have a very different style than the Rebbe's other published works. They're in kind of a shorthand. And they also very often explore topics that aren't explored in other places. So for me, it's one of my favorite Sfarim. And this Reshima I actually saw many years ago, and it stuck with me. It's something that I think about very often. Later on in Chumash, when the Torah is telling us about which animals are kosher and which animals aren't, one of the conditions for a kosher animal is that it has to have split hooves. And it says that an animal that doesn't have hooves, that has paws, isn't kosher. Rashi on that verse gives us 3 examples of animals that have paws and not hooves, and says like a dog, a cat, and a bear. Which is kind of strange. Why those 3 animals? And so the Rebbe says that there's something to be learned from each of these animals. Some sort of spiritual flaw that we can learn from these non-kosher animals and learn how to avoid ourselves. So before I tell you what it says, let me tell you why I love this Reshima so much. It's because it's counterintuitive to me. It's the opposite of what I think it'll be. The Rebbe specifically is talking about the flaws of dogs and cats in the context of moichin and midos, intellectual abilities and emotional qualities. So let me ask you, what do you think a cat is good at and bad at, and a dog is good at and bad at, in terms of intellect and emotions? To me, my gut reaction is cats are smart but emotionally distant, and dogs are a little bit not so smart, but they're very loyal and loving. But that's not how the Rebbe presents it. This is what he says. He says cats are deficient in their intellectual abilities. And he quotes that Gemara that we discussed earlier that says that cats don't recognize their owners. But their emotional qualities are good. And he quotes a Gemara that says that if the Torah would never have been given, we would have learned modesty from cats. Because cats cover up their excrement, right? They go to the bathroom in the kitty litter box and then they bury it. So we would learn tznius, modesty from a cat. So cats are modest. They have good emotional qualities, but their intellect is deficient. Dogs are the opposite. They have good intellect, makir es koine, they recognize their owner. But they are kulei lev, they are all heart. The word for dog in Hebrew is kelev, which can be connected to the phrase kulei lev. Its whole existence is emotional. And the Rebbe continues that even its superior intellect is only used to serve its own emotional desires. And then he says specifically, what kind of emotions does a dog have? Bad ones. And he quotes the Gemara that we looked at earlier that says that dogs are impudent or disrespectful. So, according to this, cats are bad at intellect but good at emotions, and dogs are good at intellect and bad at emotions. Which to me is, like I said, counterintuitive. It's not what I would normally think. So here's how that makes sense to me. I said, I think in the very first episode of the Parshah Rabbit Hole that I would warn you when I'm making stuff up. So I'm making something up right now. This is my interpretation of that Reshima from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There's a saying from Reb Zusha, one of the earliest students and teachers of Chassidus. He said, when I pass away and I go to the heavenly court, they're not going to ask me why I wasn't like the Aves, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or why I wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. They're going to ask me, why weren't you Zusha? To me, what that means is, we're not going to be asked why we didn't do the things that we're bad at. Everyone knows that the things that we're bad at, we do badly. But the things that you're good at, that's what you're accountable for. So if I'm a dog person and I'm Kool-Aid Lev, I'm all heart, I wear my heart on my sleeve, I have big emotions, nobody's going to give me a hard time that I didn't write philosophy books. What can be expected of me is that if I'm so good at emotions and I have such big and powerful feelings, then those emotions and feelings should be positive ones. I should put the work in that those very powerful emotions are constructive and positive. In other words, just because I'm Kool-Aid Lev, I'm all emotion, doesn't mean I'm good at emotions. I might still have to work on it. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, if there's something interesting that I missed that I didn't include in the video that you can share with me, please, I want to hear it. Put it in the comments. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, do that right now. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. Make sure to hold on to any dog poop you collected along the way. That stuff could be pretty valuable.